Jenny, life is like a box of chocolates. One day the word is in there, and the next day it wasn't. If that didn't make any sense to you, then you're probably new to the new conspiracy theory out there on the internet called the Mandela effect. But don't worry if you're new, because we're going to jump right into that on today's episode of Cryptos and Conspiracies. Stay with us.
Conspiracies.
Second sticks.
Conspiracies.
Hello everyone. Welcome to Cryptos and Conspiracies, episode 5. Mandela effect number 1. JFK's BerenSTAIN Residue. Today we're going to look into the conspiracy most of you are familiar with by now, the Mandela effect. Back in 2014, I came across the Mandela effect and it kind of blew my mind. What the Mandela effect essentially is, let's take this off now that we're back out here in the light. What the Mandela effect essentially is an inconsistency with people's memories and the actual historic truth of the way things are. Now, what I mean by that, well, what I meant by that back in 2014 is that things like logos, things like titles of movies, dialogue lines inside of movies, seem to be different from the way people actually remembered them. So, like we were talking about with Forrest Gump and the line, life is like a box of chocolates, is actually, life was like a box of chocolates. So therefore, what people remembered is actually different from what the actual reality is. Now, that seems pretty simple if you think about it. What we think of when we think of that is, well, people just misremembered the line. Or in the case of life is like a box of chocolates, it's very easy to think, well, normally, psychologically, you would just insert is into the line instead of was, because it's more common for us to say life is like something as opposed to life was like something. So it's very easy on an example like the Forrest Gump line to kind of write it off and think, well, think nothing of it. Likewise with the Star Wars line, Luke, I am your father. It's actually, no, I am your father. So in that example, it's a little bit more tricky because what we see in this example is a lot more of what we call residue. Residue being things that line up with people's misremembered thoughts. So in the case of, well, this is a good one, the Star Wars case, there's actually a line where, or a video where James Earl Jones is talking to a reporter, and he's talking about the line, Luke, I am your father. And he's saying, yeah, well, I remembered when I saw this line written on paper when I was getting ready for the part, that he's got to be lying. So he was getting into it. He was trying to think psychologically how he was going to play that event, or how he was going to play that line. As actors do. All good actors are going to think about that. Okay, well, how exactly is it that I'm going to play this line? If he's lying, it's going to come out a little bit different than if he was actually telling the truth. So I'll have a link to that down in the description so you can go back and see James Earl Jones talking about that. But, you know, then you got to go revisit the movie and see that the line is actually, "No, I am your father." And it becomes even more interesting. In the case of the Star Wars example, I always like to, well, my favorite residual evidence of it being Luke, I am your father, is there's an old cartoon. Well, there's a million cartoons if you Google it on, if you just Google it up. There's a cartoon of a guitar talking to a little uke, and the guitar says to the ukulele, "Uke, I am your father." So that's what we mean by residual evidence. Now, what makes the Mandela effect so intriguing is the fact that even though there's so many people that have the same misremembered memory, there's all kinds of evidence. Once you go back into the internet, you'll find that even if it's a logo that has been changed, it actually hasn't just been changed like as an update. You'll find that it's been that way forever. So it's very interesting in how this kind of comes across, where something that has been misremembered by tons and tons of people has been misremembered by everybody completely together in the same way. But you look back and you find that the actual physical evidence is that no, it hasn't been changed. It's always been that way. We've just collectively misremembered them. So why this is so important, this misremembering, is it really brings up the question, what is going on here? Is it that there's really something that it's just a collective, a huge amount of people that have collectively misremembered this, whatever it is, this logo, this title, this book, this line of dialogue? Or has it somehow been magically changed? And by magically changed, what I really mean to say is just bearing in mind the great science fiction writer, Arthur C. Clarke, when he said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." So yeah, let's just say there is some sort of crazy magic going on, but that could just be a sufficiently advanced technology, let's say. And then there's a lot of theories about, oh, these are parallel universes crossing over in the minds of men, right? So that some certain reality of the millions of different dimensions or different realities has actually crossed over, and now what we're seeing is the crossing of these things and the inconsistencies that come about. So what I've found is when at first I was super intrigued by this whole Mandela effect. And I went and I told all my family and friends about it, and I was very surprised to find out that almost nobody else was very interested in the Mandela effect. Once they saw the evidence, once they looked into the internet and found out, oh well, no, it's actually this way, we must have misremembered, almost everybody writes it off and very quickly loses interest. The people like me, however, who still retain an interest in the Mandela effect, I find have one common experience. And that common experience is they have some sort of a vivid memory in the past. For example, for me, it was the Berenstein Bears, the Berenstein Bears being changed to the Berenstein Bears. How could that be? Well, for me, it was the fact that I had this very vivid memory of looking at this book. I can still picture it in my sister's room when I was a kid, and I can see that it was a yellow cover, said Berenstein Bears, and I remember saying, is it Berenstein or Berenstein? Berenstein or Berenstein? And as a young kid, I mean, we had family friends, the Feldsteins. There's always Benstein. But as a kid, there was still that question of, hey, is it always the same? You know, in the English language, you don't always know that it's always pronounced one way when it's spelled one way. But I remember having this vivid thought of, Berenstein Berenstein, and making a little sing-song out of it, like Stein or Steen, Stein or Steen. So when I saw that it was actually Berenstein Bears, I was pretty moved. That was a pretty big deal for me, because obviously having that really vivid memory made it very difficult for me to conform to the idea that it was Berenstein Bears, and it always has been. But it's really difficult. The most difficult part of this is that when you go back and you find an actual hard cover, it's not just the internet. So, you know, the fact that people would say it's, you know, some sort of AI that's able to change things on the internet. Well, it's not just that, because you can now go back and you find books, old dusty books, and it says Berenstein Bears. You know, that's how it goes. And what happened to me was I basically kind of decided after a while, it's not that I lost my interest in the Mandela effect, but after a while, you can only go so far into thinking like this logo or this line or this title, you know, Sex in the City is now Sex and the City, whoa, or Interview with a Vampire is Interview with the Vampire, or wow. All those things are really great and fun for a while, but once it gets to a point where you're actually trying to make a living, you're trying to, you know, have a spiritual life, you're trying to have relationships, it's not that I lost my interest in it, it's just that it became for me after a few years, I'd almost forgotten. Mandela effect, okay, whatever. But it wasn't until 2017 when my interest got renewed. In 2017, I heard about a new Mandela effect that I hadn't heard of in the past, and that was the Lion and the Lamb. It was the Bible had been changed. And so my ears pricked up. And I'm not a Bible scholar, and I'm not someone who has committed Bible verses to memory, but I did grow up Catholic, and I went to Catholic churches. I was an altar boy for a short while. Yeah, I went to catechism on Wednesdays. We did Bible studies. I have a familiarity for sure, but not only that, but there was a Christian bookstore in our town called the Lion and the Lamb Christian Bookstore. So when I heard that the Lion and the Lamb was actually the Wolf and the Lamb, woo, Isaiah 11:6. Check it out, it's changed, it's totally different. Now, a lot of you again are gonna chalk it up to collective false memories, whatever, but once I heard that the Bible had been changed, it wasn't just logos and little things like lines in pop movies like Forrest Gump, what have you. I remember writing to a friend, my only friend, who had kind of shared my interest in the Mandela effect, and I wrote to her and said, wow, if they could actually change the Bible and history, ... it's all over. Because it's true. I mean, the Bible and history are kind of that's our connection to our past. That's a person without a history is like a dust blowing in the wind, I think someone once said. So anyways, that was the big one for me back 2017. And again, life caught up and I didn't really think about it much for a couple more years until recently. I was floored again, once again. Not more than a matter of months ago, I came across a new Mandela effect. And this time it had to do with JFK and his final ride in that fateful limo. And so what happened was, well, let me preface with this. I was actually being interested in conspiracy theories. You can imagine that I had seen the Zapruder film in the past, right? So There was a conspiracy theory that, and about 5 or 6 years ago, came across maybe it's super old, but I came across it 5 or 6 years ago, and it was to have a look at the film, the Zapruder film once again, have a look at it and watch the hand of the driver, the left hand of the driver. And I thought, okay, well, I'm actually not a person who likes to relive moments like that. I don't like watching the Zapruder film. I don't like watching any type of horrible footage of anyone getting hurt, or I'm not the kind of person who goes and watches those super awful things where people die and get hurt and all that kind of stuff. It sticks to my mind. I'm not really good with that type of stuff, but being that the JFK assassination is probably one of the biggest conspiracies in all of time, I've had to look at it, and I've looked at it hundreds of times. So I went back, taking this person's advice, I went back to have a look at the Zapruder film. This time, only looking at the driver's left hand, right at the moment of impact, right at the fateful moment when, you know, at first Kennedy holds his throat, and then a couple seconds later, a couple instants later, he takes impact from the final bullet. And most of the time when you're watching that footage, you're looking at JFK, of course, and Jackie, and for good reason. And so you never really look at the driver. But after having heard that, I went back and I looked at the driver and watched his hand, and I'll put a link down below. It's called the undamaged Zapruder film. And if you watch that between seconds 50 and 54, you'll see what I'm talking about. That's not even what we're talking about here, though. That's not even the Mandela effect that I'm here to discuss, and I'm not even trying to advance that as a conspiracy theory. All I'm saying is that was a very strange piece, and I looked so many times at the Zapruder film, watching between the driver's hand and the impact of JFK's head. So you can imagine my absolute surprise and shock when recently it was called to my attention that there weren't really 4 people in that fateful car, in that limo that day. There was actually 6. So now there's a new Mandela effect. For those of you who are not aware, there's a new Mandela effect where if you go back and you look at the footage of the Zapruder film, you'll find that the limo has changed. There's new side glass and a whole set of seats between the driver and JFK. So that one was a big one for me. I don't know how to describe it any better, but that one blew me away. So now that there are 6 people in the limo as opposed to 4, it makes the whole idea of a gunman being the driver a little bit more than preposterous, right? But you can see if there was actually 4 people in the car, why people would have looked into this conspiracy theory in the past. Makes things a little more uncertain. So, are we living in a time with technology that's able to change verses from the Bible and historical events? Or are people just misremembering on a massive scale? Or are we having crossing over of different dimensions, different realities, parallel universes? Those are some of the questions we'll have to explore in future episodes of Cryptos and Conspiracies. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Cryptos and Conspiracies, and I hope you'll join us on future episodes. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you then.